This is the second studio by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Bourderonnet. This week, it's the two of us, and we are going to talk about 5 things clients should know before starting their project. This is a part 2. We did a part 1. We did 5 things clients should know. I think it was like half a year ago or something. So now this is a part 2. 5 new things that they should know about. And basically, that's what we're going to talk about today.
All right, so out of the 5 points that we're going to talk about today, what is the first one?
The first one has to do with clients starting their project. So we're huge advocates of clients doing their research. That means talking to several architects, several designers, interviewing contractors, especially if they're new to this whole process, to understand the lay of the land and then obviously make decisions as to who to hire. Like, doing research is great, but we have seen fairly often in our own experiences and through our colleagues that there are some clients who attempt to make significant progress in the design process before actually hiring an architect.
Right.
So they try to start without starting.
Right.
And so what they do is they will talk to a lot of several different architects and contractors and other professionals, not just for the sake of research, but because they think that the more people they talk with and the more thinking they do on their end, the more that they can advance the design process and shortcut it. So in their minds, it's a way to expedite the design process and a lot of times cut down the fee. So in other words, if I'm the client, and I've spoken with 5 different architects, 5 different contractors, some engineers, and et cetera. Now I come to you and I say, well, I've already done all this research and I spoke with all these people. I know that this is what I want. So therefore, can we just skip over this part of the design, right? And I can understand why a person would think that because obviously everyone wants things to be more efficient and not waste time or money. But I will say from hard evidence that never really works. It never really works. And so if you are interested in doing a project, to really make progress in it, to make progress in the design phases, which is the beginning phases, you just have to start. You have to start working with someone in a serious way, not just having casual conversations on site and saying, well, what if we do this? What if we do that? Okay, let me bring another person and also talk about that idea again, another idea, and sort of piecemeal stuff on your own.
Well, and I think also a lot of the times when clients do that before committing to an architect, they kind of like set their mind on things that in a way are decisions that come like way further down on the design process. It's not immediate stuff. You know, it's like, oh, they've already picked out tires or like roof materials or like windows. And it's like, that's great, but we're not quite there yet. And actually, that's not the most important information to start with. That's not what's gonna drive the design and its process.
I think that's true. I think there is this, what happens like almost psychologically with clients in those situations is they become fixed to those decisions also. And here's the interesting thing too about architecture and design is that it's very complex because every decision you make in terms of design impacts another decision. So I say it often, but designing a house is much like creating a very complex 3-dimensional puzzle, and every piece interlocks with another one. And that's what we're trained in. That's what we do. For clients who are not experts in this field, they will gravitate toward a few of the pieces, like the windows or the curtains or whatever it is that you mentioned. But they don't understand the bigger picture of all the 100 other things that we have to consider. So I think the issue is twofold. One, they become kind of fixated on certain things when, again, they're missing their larger vision and the design foundation for that vision. And 2, those things that they're considering are oftentimes, frankly, just short-sighted because there's other stuff that has to be considered.
I think they are very specific and tangible things because most people don't have an understanding of what like the whole picture that you're describing. They don't understand the complexity of every single decision that goes into a project. It's not just about how much the window costs. It's what is it made of? How is it going to fit in the elevation?
I think that's true. I think also people might not realize, but architecture and design at a fundamental level is a conceptual exercise, and that's actually where it starts. is at with the first phase really is concept design, but it's at the conceptual level. It's understanding all of this kind of meta information, why people are doing the project and the goals and the site and all this stuff. And then afterwards, you build up from that, become more refined into finally you're selecting the doors and windows. So actually, if we stick on the subject of doors and windows or that example, the selection of the doors and the windows happens way, way, way later into the design process. And that conceptual layer, that base I'm describing, it's murky, it's weird. It's not something that most people have practice in thinking about, right? And so another way to describe how this problem occurs or why it occurs is most often when clients approach an architect and they say, architect, here's my project brief, here are my goals, here are some specific things I want because I'm quirky and I like the color red. I've always wanted a red chair and can we have that? Or I've always wanted a wall that's pink or whatever it might be. The architect, we will take all that information and then there's a healthy amount of disruption that we bring to the table. So there's a constructive criticism of that set of information and there's an expanding on that set of information. So that initial first few conversations and design pitches with the client sometimes kind of rocks their world because you're like, whoa, I didn't think about this other solution that you're proposing, but you're right. Based on my objectives, what you're proposing actually makes sense. It's just going to take me a minute to kind of adjust my eyesight because this is different from what I had envisioned. Yeah. And that happens with us. That happens, I would say, with any good architect. And it is an example and evidence as to the problem that takes place, as what we're describing. So if the architect's first proposals oftentimes are a little bit disruptive, it's telling you that probably whatever amount of research or designing that the client's trying to do internally on their own is just going to get obliterated. It's not going to be really relevant after the first meeting, frankly.
And I think also it depends on people's ability to receive criticism on those decisions too. Like if you've made 15 decisions in your head about what the project should be on this, and that, and someone you hire comes in and tells you, no, like most of your decisions actually are not making sense, or they're not making sense right now, we're not going to talk about it. There's going to be kind of a not so great workflow, I would say, that could be very frustrating for the clients because in their head, they've already like made 10 steps ahead. And now you're asking them to delete those 10 steps ahead and restart from zero. So it's a little bit frustrating. So I would say, don't try to dive too much into making your decisions before you hire someone on your project.
And really all of this is much more of a psychological issue than anything else, right? So we've had clients come to us with sketches, with reference images, which is very common today with Pinterest, with all this information. And honestly, it can be totally fine, provided that their mindset is such that they're like, here's this information, but I'm totally open to whatever you suggest. This is just what I've been, kicking around in my mind for the last year or 6 months or a few years. Again, it's a distinction between that situation versus clients who are like, oh, I've already talked to a bunch of people, so guess what? Like, we don't need you to do this thing. I want to, take that part out of your services and just go this route instead. And that's when it gets into problematic territory.
It's like if you go to the dentist and you're like, I already know this is what I want to do.
Sure.
I know I want a crown. I want it here. I want it there. I want that color. I don't want you to clean my teeth before you do it. Yeah. It's like, it's not when you go to a professional that has a process of how they work. They have protocols and things that they have in place in order for them to do their work well. And if you kind of like, tell them what steps they should be taking and not taking, it's a little bit confusing for them too, and honestly frustrating and sometimes limiting in how they can perform.
Yeah, and I think many professionals, almost all professions, would have this same point, frankly, of in the case of doctors, patients to use WebMD, and they're like, well, guess what? I looked online, so just write me the prescription, doctor, and I'll be good to go. So what's the solution? I think that a more productive way of thinking about this starting to work with an architect or a designer is approaching it much more like a close collaboration. So there's no need for the client to feel like they have to figure out all this stuff first and then approach an architect. It's not necessary for that, because even if you do, again, we're going to deconstruct all of that information as step one as part of our analysis, and then take the right steps in the correct direction. So approaching your architect and thinking about them or us as a kind of close friend, collaborative person is good. That's a great way to do it. And by the way, the design process for a house is iterative anyway. Iterative meaning we are going to produce many iterations of the design. So we produce multiple options for one meeting, say 3 options typically. We have a conversation, we revise, have another meeting, show another 2 or 3 options, revise, and that goes forward. So the entire design process is not as 1 step, 2 step, and then we're done. It's a lot of micro steps going forward 3, back 1, forward 3, back 1. And I think if you have that mentality and that approach and you're open about things and honest, that's really the best way for a great design in the end, but also a more efficient process totally. Because I do find actually when clients I can try to solve too many things on their own, it ends up being actually less efficient because we have to somehow make sure that we have to think about what they're thinking and try and ease into new ideas, which takes more time to approach the work that way.
Yeah, and oftentimes those decisions are not made with the understanding of all of the things that go into the decision. So
yeah, it's absolutely true. And I do also want to say that I totally understand from a client's perspective why they would attempt to do what we're outlining. And one of the reasons is a fear of commitment, right? Because you don't want to sign on to an architect and feel like you're stuck with them before you know them. Or
if your budget is limiting and you just want to control, how the process is going to go to make sure that you're not, spending a ton of money on people doing things that maybe you feel you could have done yourself.
That's true too. I think controlling costs is another, and we'll talk about costs in a second later on, but I think the best way to control cost is to find trusted professionals and be very thorough and detailed throughout the entire process. So shortcuts in quotes, as shortcuts don't really exist in design and construction. They just don't. But for anyone who's feeling like they're hesitant to commit to an architect, that is also why in our office we provide short-term services at the beginning of a project for new clients. And we've talked about this before on here, but we call them project starter services. And it's a fixed fee, short-term feasibility service plus some concept design work. And it's we found it very helpful for ourselves, for clients, and hopefully for other architects if they're listening, that it's a way to alleviate that pressure, right? And also allow the client to actually start, for real start, and see real work done, but there's just no long-term commitment.
And start thinking about the decisions that they will have to make without having to make the final decisions then. Like it's just kind of like getting the ball rolling.
Exactly.
Which kind of goes nicely into the next point, which is basically figuring out why you are doing the project. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably the most crucial information you could come to an architect with, rather than what kind of windows you want. Mm-hmm, it's really like, why are you doing this project? Why are you building a new house? Why are you remodeling your house? Like, how long are you planning to live here? Like, really the questions that ties the project to you personally, mm-hmm. and the things that anyone who's going to need to design is going to need to know in order to design it properly.
I think another way to phrase that question, the question being, why are you doing this project? Another way to phrase it is, what do you want this project to give you? What do you want to gain from this whole thing when it's done, right? And sometimes those gains are usually they're financial in a sense, like you want return on investment at some point. Sometimes that's much more of the primary objective. That's like 95% of why you're doing the project, because I want to develop the property, live in it for a few months, and then I'm going to sell it, right? Well, in that case, return on investment is very, very high on the list. Yeah. Other cases, it's, I want a vacation house for my family to be able to relax. So it needs to provide that kind of experience for us to take a break from our crazy, city lives in New York City or whatever place. Or this is a long-term home for my 2 kids who were about to be born to grow up in, and we're going to be a family, and we want to be able to expand and maybe have more kids and expand over time. So there's a lot of different motivations, right? But and some of the answers to that question are a little more, they're more deeply rooted than people might think, So one of the common errors I see that clients make when we ask these questions or they're posed these questions is they start listing the stuff that's going to be in the house, like the
Right.
doors and windows, even bedroom counts, and floor materials and whatever else. That's all still helpful information for us to have. The more information, the better. But again, those fall into the what category. And we're really trying to understand the motivations of the project. Again, the foundation. We're building the foundation conceptually, and then we work from there eventually to details like the specific things that are going into the house.
Yeah, it's kind of the big picture goal, right? It's funny because, again, sometimes people get very... they've thought a lot about, the style of the house, or like what kind of home do they like? They like modern, mid-century, or
Style,
like
yeah.
classical and
Like
things like
aesthetic.
that. Aesthetic. But I don't think actually that many people think about like, okay, do I see myself living in this same exact house I'm designing today in 30 years? Am I gonna be able to raise 2 kids here? How are my kids going to evolve in those spaces in this house? What do I want my family to feel like in this house? Do I want everybody to live in their own spaces? Do I want, in a common quarter where we all gather? Do I want to share everything with them, at all times?
Yeah.
And those are kind of more personal questions, which is sometimes difficult to talk about when you just hire or are about to hire an architect, because it's things you'll probably share with your friends about, like your big questions about life and how you see yourself and your family in, 10, 15 years or so. But it's super important, and under that thick layer of big picture, there is a lot of embedded smaller layers that I think if you don't give the designer that kind of like master vision, it's going to be very hard for them to find the right sublayer to that.
Even on the question of aesthetics, like you mentioned a moment ago, right? If someone says, I want a mid-century modern house, we both love mid-century modern, so it's like, ooh, that's cool. Let's have a conversation. It would be important for us to understand why they're drawn to that style, right?
Yeah.
If it's because, and there's many different reasons why someone could like a style. And also, again, some of these answers the clients owners, they don't have the answer to yet. So if you're thinking about doing a project, it's worthwhile to kind of ask yourself these questions and poke at yourself and go further and further down the why list. But for liking mid-century modern, it could be because, well, I grew up in an Eichler, which is a type of mid-century modern house, very iconic in California. I grew up in an Eichler and it reminds me of X, Y, and Z, so I want that again. Or I really like the exposure to the exteriors, right? That's not the same thing as I grew up in that same house when I was a kid. Or thirdly, well, I like modern, but a lot of modern stuff in my views feels very cold. And what I've seen of mid-century, it feels warmer. Okay, that's also very different from liking exposure to the exteriors. So I think peeling the onion, as they say,
Right.
is crucial. I think another good and simple analogy to all of this is imagine that you're a client and you're going to hire a travel planner or an agent for you.
A travel agent
to figure out this trip, right? Probably the first question they're going to ask you is, why are you taking this trip?
The first question is, how many people?
Yeah, how many people? How many people and where?
As basic as that. Right?
No, same thing is like the same thing for us. Like, who's going to live in the house? And sometimes when I have calls with prospective clients, they're like, what do you mean who's going to live in the house? I'm like, well, I need to know.
I don't know you.
Is it you and your partner, you and your 5 kids, your 10 kids, you and your grandparents and your kids? Like, who is it?
Yeah.
And how often are they going to be there? But let's say you have this travel agent, right? And you're going to Italy. They would ask you, why are you going to Italy? And if you think about it, right? If a customer or a client says, well, I'm going to Italy because I've never, ever been to Europe. This is probably the only time I'm going to go to Italy. So I want to see the biggest attractions and as much stuff as possible in the 2 weeks I have, right? Then the travel agent will plot out a trip that's according to that. That is one based on a very specific vision or desired outcome, what you want the trip to give you.
Right.
Versus saying, I've been to Italy 50 times already, and I want to go to see and experience the local culture that's no one knows about, right? That's a very different motivation.
Very unique experience.
Exactly. Or thirdly, I'm an Instagram influencer. I just want to go to the most touristy spots for the best photographs possible, right? In each of those cases, each of those three clients are looking for very different outcomes. They want the trip to give them very, very different things. And so therefore the professional, the travel agent / architect, we prescribe things that fit what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to get to.
Yeah.
But if you don't, as a client, have an understanding of what is the force that's pulling me in this direction, right? Then, it becomes very difficult because we're kind of, steering a ship without a compass. We need to understand that, again, that conceptual base. So that way, when we get into the details or even the program, how many bedrooms and how many offices, how many whatever, it makes sense for you. Like we had a project one time. It was a remodel. Was it remodel? It was a remodel, let's say. And it was for a family of 4 or 5, I think. And we were looking at their existing floor plan, and it wasn't super great, the floor plan. And we were looking at some ideas that they had, the client had for this new floor plan. And they had a relatively small family room and a relatively small, let's call it a great room, that were separated. And they had a bunch of bedrooms, all throughout their house, a bunch of bedrooms. And in talking with them, we would ask them, what do you want this new house to give you? What experience do you want to gain from it? And they said, well, I really want to be able to have us gather as a family of 5 and have fun together, because that's what we do. It's very important for us as a family that we spend meals together, we do game nights together, we spend a lot of time together. I want that. So that's great. The floor plan that I'm seeing does the exact opposite. The floor plan I'm seeing is very good if you want everyone to be in their own rooms in different sections of the house, in different quadrants of the house, because that's how it's designed. So then we inverted it. We said, well, look, if your vision is to have this experience, then let's prioritize the shared communal areas and have different types of gathering spaces. So you can have big gathering spaces, small ones, intermediate ones near the outdoors, ones that are for gaming and enclosed, and variety of that, right? And make the bedrooms not be dispersed across all different areas, and make the bedrooms not be in the middle of the house, right?
And not as big.
And not as big, So that's an example as to why having this information is essential.
Yeah, and each project is unique, I mean, I would never approach a project thinking like, okay, well, everybody needs a dining room, a living room, this and that, and this and that. It really depends. I mean, it's kind of a design is a la carte, and should be, to me, a la carte. Like, that's kind of why you're paying somebody to design something for you. Well, they're creating the menu
it's
as you're
menu.
waiting in the restaurant.
That's basically what it is,
That's like omakase type of experience, maybe, which to me is the value that you get when you seek the help of a design professional. Is that if you don't want that, if you want a prefix menu, then you just go to the store and you go to McDonald's, pick out of their menu, drive through, even don't even get out of your car, get it delivered to your home, even like you don't bother to go through that process. So yeah, therefore the process is it takes a little bit more effort from the client side. And I would say like the whole question of why you're doing this project and all of those personal questions it's really important. It's also what's gonna help you make the decisions further down the line. If you have a 100%. Clear picture of what is it that this project is going to be, what it should bring you, and those are only emotions that the client can feel. Like we will tell the clients, a lot of those options are right, but one of them is going to feel more right for yourself. And I can tell you which one I think is going to be best, but you are the one who has to make that decision. And you have to be comfortable enough to make that decision.
I agree. And
it starts with just getting comfortable with asking yourself those questions and answering them. And that would be a kind of a warm up to decision-making time.
The suggestion here is really a process of self-reflection.
Yeah.
And if we get really kind of philosophical, it's about actually knowing yourself and what stage you are in life and what stage you want to be at in the next phase. So it might sound like that's putting a lot of pressure on the client. And in a way, there's responsibilities the client has, which I've outlined here. But I do also want to say that for us and how we practice, I do believe it is the architect's and designer's responsibility to extract this information from the client, to bring these questions to the surface and almost, require the client to think about these things. And so that's why in our process, we start with a questionnaire for clients, and beyond the questionnaire, we always ask questions throughout the entire process to try and understand them better and better and better. I would go as far to say that if an architect does not do that, that they're doing a disservice to the work and to the clients. So, there is shared responsibility, and it's not just for the sake of the final product. It also makes the process way, way more efficient.
Yeah.
Way more efficient. So, real quickly, for us, like I said, we do a questionnaire. We do some other things in-house to understand the client before we put pen to paper, right? And those handful of hours we spend doing that, interfacing with the client, for some folks, for some clients, it seems like this is kind of excessive. Can we just start? But I'm telling you, spending a little bit of time now to do those things will save us hours and save us full meetings later on, because now when we start drawing, we have a very good sense, or a much better sense of who you are. And the more that we can develop that as we go on, the more efficient the process becomes, right? Yeah. Like if you imagine by the end of the project, if we have to make a decision about swapping one material for another because it's no longer available, we've known you for, let's say, a year. I know very well what material you're going to like and not like. So I can present you 3 options knowing that these 3 are great options for you, and probably knowing one is the one that you're going to choose, right? Because I've known you for so long. So it's the same thing for us, right? Extracting that information, bringing these questions to the top of the surface is critical at the outset.
And it also, I think, ultimately makes the decision on the client side easier to make. If you have someone on the other side that understands who you are, what you're into, what you like, what you don't like, what you need, what you don't need.
It's true, because what slows down the design process more than anything else, is indecisiveness.
Indecisiveness and from the client, and that means maybe that at some point the design that was pitched wasn't the right one. Therefore, at some point there is a part of the communication that did not happen, or there is something that gets skipped, or there is an answer that wasn't given like sincerely or honestly or really thought about.
Yep. And so I think the lack of confidence in the decisions being made can happen because the proper research wasn't done at the beginning, like you're saying. It also sometimes clients are indecisive people, just inherently that's who they are. But also, again, it's they don't know who they are. They don't know what they like. So so if you are thinking about a project, I think it's worthwhile to kind of poke at these questions on your own and start to think about them.
And it's interesting. Sometimes we have clients who know themselves really well, and that could be really good. That could also be not so good, because then again there is maybe a little bit of an ego, like I know what I like, or it could be limiting to the design itself, because they know what they like so much that they're not willing to challenge what they like, or maybe see if they might like something else.
Well, I think that's interesting. I think that now we're just talking about the psychology of clients, but I think that's actually categorically a different issue. I think that issue is basically just one of ego and control. Now, by the way, if a client comes to us and says, I have a very clear vision of what I want, I've thought about it for 10 years, and this is what I want, and it aligns with our ethos, then let's rock and roll. Let's do it. And it'll be very efficient.
But in other cases, we have clients who might have a vague idea of what they like, and then really discover themselves through the process.
Yep.
And that's extremely gratifying for us, because it's not like we just design their houses. We also help them design themselves in a way, or understand themselves.
Oh, that's absolutely the case. That's absolutely the case. That's also why I do think a big role of the architect, again, is knowing what questions to ask. Because it's a funny thing that if you ask the right questions, the right answers tend to come with it, right? That's how it tends to work. So in, I think, another recording, I talk about architecture is essentially problem solving, right? Yeah. That's what it is. And really, before problem solving is defining the problem, and therefore asking the right questions. And it's just a weird thing in design. If you do that, the solutions are there. It's like really odd. They're almost, the solutions write themselves. They draw themselves.
I worked on a beach house once in my previous lives, and the client did not like the sun.
Yeah.
And it always puzzled me, then why would you want a house on the beach if you don't like the sun? And the whole, facade facing the ocean was glass. And I'm like, did someone at some point did not have this conversation with her to understand that no, she would never go outside on the giant deck that's being built facing the beach because she does not like the sun. And it's very silly to me that you would get that far without having got to that question and trigger design decisions and construction costs and all of those things being built that will ultimately never be used the way they were intended to be used because that piece of information was never connected to the other ones.
Well, so if the project is in a place like the Hamptons, we're talking about people who have a lot of money. Sometimes people build things for investment purposes and frankly, just for bragging rights, which I'm not going to judge them for that. So if they want to create this thing for essentially bragging rights, that's cool. But I do think knowing that is important because because we have to spend less time worrying about other things.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it does actually become more efficient because we're not having to worry about X, Y, and Z concerns of the client because they're not concerned about those things. They just don't care. They want this cool looking sculpture on the beach that everyone can see. Right. All right. The third thing clients should know is something that happens very often in almost every project for every person. So at some point throughout the project, whether it be during design, permitting, CDs, or construction, the client will feel like, I think I can get lucky here, and we don't have to be as thorough or as detailed in this decision, in this operation, in this whatever it is. And I think I'm going to get lucky and it's going to work out. Don't do that. Don't do that.
Do you think that means that they gave up? Like I don't know, is it their stamina that's just like kind of like cold quits and they just want to...
Sometimes it's stamina. I think that's true. I think that's maybe a different issue. I'm saying very specifically that people think, I think I'm going to be okay. I'm the lucky one in this instance. I think I'm just going to roll the dice, and I'm sure that the gods are in line with me, and everything else has gone fine. So I'm going to roll the dice on this one, and it's going to turn out. And what's an example of that? It could be that, okay, we have this paint color, right? Instead of doing a mock-up of the paint color in a test, it's like, well, based on the tiny sample, I think it's good. Let's just go for it, right? It's going to be okay. Let's just go for it. Both of those ideas, anything in that space, don't do that. Don't do it. Not even once throughout the entire project.
It's interesting. Like, what would you do that if you've come that far in the process?
There's just this.
Like, is it an ego? Is it you feel like you're not being challenged anymore, so you're trying to like bring some risk back into the process? No, seriously. Like, it's like, oh, my food has been tasting good so far, but I'm gonna try hot sauce today. And it's like, well, you don't know if you can handle hot sauce. Are you sure you want to try that? You might be sick afterwards, and then you won't be able to taste anything.
I don't know. I mean, we can make our guesses. I personally think that there's this human tendency, this itch that we have, all of us have. Like, I think it's gonna work, because we want to be that lucky one. We want to be the one that pulled the golden ticket to go to Willy Wonka's factory, and we think, right? We got the ticket. We have the lottery number. There's always that little bit of itch. I think I have the winning one. Whether it be the full project that they're just going to wing, or again, one decision about paint color or one decision about something else. And the lesson here is basically do not do that. The design and construction is basically, to sound very off-putting, is just a field of landmines of problems waiting to happen, right? That's what it is.
You're basically sprinting through a field of landmines. That's what it is.
And what you want to do is you want to be prepared by doing as much research in the landmine analogy and finding out where all the landmines are. So every step you take is with complete and total confidence in the right spot. Every single step for the next mile. Right? That's what design and construction is like. And every misstep you take triggers another problem. Always the case. Sometimes that problem is triggered immediately, if you're lucky. Other times that problem is triggered months down the line and it ends up being much bigger. So that's a way of saying that the real way to have success in a project is to never, ever, ever think you're going to be just the fortunate one and that luck is going to be on your side, and luck is a thing that you're going to use to have a good outcome regarding the whole project or, again, one specific thing, because it just never happens. And I know any contractors listening to this are shaking their heads and saying this, yes, it doesn't work out.
I mean, projects are complex enough that you don't need to add yourself to the mix.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there is already, like you said, enough things that are going to go wrong at some point, that why tempt the devil in the middle of it?
Yeah. Just being unrelentingly thorough and consistent and detailed in everything in the project is the way to have success. And I know for some clients, if they're listening, they're like, oh, that sounds like very intense. I don't want to go through that. Well, that's why you have professionals. So just trust the professionals if you've hired good ones, and rely on them to let you know, to the degree of thoroughness that is required. And this leads nicely to the fourth point, which is sometimes clients, especially if they're very successful in their own industry, they're a CEO or they have a successful tech company or whatever, they think that they can hack, manipulate, or shortcut or modify the design and construction process to make it more efficient, right? Because they're very successful in their own industry. They're disruptors in that space. They've revolutionized it. They've done whatever. And they think, well, I'm so good at that, and maybe my other businesses as well, I'm going to do the same thing in design and construction. Now, complete and full respect for all those individuals. And I also fully sympathize and empathize as to why you would feel that way, because I feel that way from time to time regarding other professions. However, I would say that for architecture, design, and construction, these are not industries you want to try and tamper with in that way. We've seen it, countless times on our own and through colleagues. Again, it's one of those missteps, one of those things that happens that when it occurs, it does not work out and ends up dragging things on longer and causing more problems than solutions.
Yeah, and the thing is that people have to understand is that architecture, interior design, those design and construction professions are very tangled beasts, right? It's like if you grab a ball of, rubber bands that are all tied together in a way that creates a ball that stays together, right? Mm-hmm. That means every single part is dependent on the other one. And the process is like that. Every single part is tied to the one adjacent to it, next to it, before and after it, above and below it. Mm-hmm. So if you disrupt that spot, it's gonna impact others.
That's the case, and it's not to say that we don't welcome input or different ideas, because there are times when clients have ideas. You're like, that's an interesting proposition. Let's go for it. It's more the issue of when clients have an idea, the professionals say, I don't think we should do that, and they say, well, let's do it anyway.
Well, the thing is, usually when there is a process, there's different steps that you have to follow to get to a place. It's like an itinerary if you go on a trip, right?
Sure.
You have step 1, step 2, step 3, and you could try and hop from step 1 and step 3, but you're gonna shortcut step 2, and therefore you're gonna miss something there, right? What I'm saying is that when you're trying to shortcut a process, mm-hmm. it's most likely going to be in a negative way, meaning something is being taken out, something is being amputated from the process itself.
Right.
It's not like you're making it more concise or smaller. Oftentimes, like you're just lobbing off a chunk of the process.
Yeah, right.
And that's where it's not good. Like if you're trying to make the process more efficient, but you're not skipping that step, I think that's totally fine, and we should all aim to do that. But if you're trying to remove a part of the process that is crucial for it, at some point, it's not going to feel right.
So an example of these kinds of shortcuts or manipulations of the process that we see often is clients wanting to get rid of construction documents or to reduce them significantly or reduce the amount of work that goes into them, thinking that they can take the permit drawings, which are used to get a permit, which are different from a construction document set, and they want to take those permit drawings and just use those to build the house, right? And I can understand from an outsider's perspective where CDs seem like this thing that you could get rid of, or an architect's performing construction administration that is being involved during construction. You could also get rid of that maybe if I have a really good contractor. Like, these are ideas that kicked around. And it just doesn't work for high-end home building, right? If you're trying to do a spec house or something, then this is not the conversation for you anyway, so that do whatever. But a cheap spec house, that's not a nice one. But for anything, again, that's custom and high-end and nice or decent, there are these things you go through. And as you kind of alluded to earlier, like, the professions of architecture, design, and construction have been around for some time. And there's a lot of professionals doing it. I mean, construction is a big industry. There's just thousands of houses being built every day in one small region. And so if there are some, call them best practices and standard methods and processes and phases, like we talk about concept design, schematic design, DD, design development, permitting, construction documents, those things, they're there for a reason, right? And they've evolved for a reason. By the end of the project, you will have hundreds, maybe even thousands of different hands touching the project. And the GC, the general contractor, or the construction manager, they're the person who's managing, who's responsible for managing every one of those people, right? And there's a site super, and then there's a project manager, there's a project engineer. There's all of these layers. I mean, really, it is, every project is like you're forming a brand new joint venture with hundreds of different people, right? Who all have experience doing this thing for decades. And it's very dangerous territory when you come in and start kind of moving things around within it. Again, it's not to say that ideas are not welcome, but I would just, manage expectations if you're thinking that you're going to be able to disrupt and improve things by, on the margin of 20% more efficient.
Well, and oftentimes clients want to manipulate or shortcut the process for two things. It's usually schedule, like how much time it's going to take, and money, how much it's going to cost, right? And it's those are two big ones, and I understand you want to do that, and it makes sense. But I think if you are planning on disrupting the process on those two things or one thing, that should be talked about at the very beginning and strategize on how you can make those more efficient or reduce them, but not doing it throughout a phase. Like, kind of like you said, like winging it. Well, now we're just going to take this out, not do this, not do that. No, you have to have a plan. You have to think about those things from the very beginning and see what makes sense before you dive into it, because that's ultimately how you make a process more efficient, is when you think about it before you even start it.
Well, this also reminds me, a lot of this conversation and what we're describing or trying to emphasize is the intricacy and interconnectedness of design and construction, right? Everything's like that ball of rubber bands you mentioned. And so let's say you have an architect or a contractor and you're pitching to both of them this idea for making things more efficient, and it involves reducing stuff, cutting out stuff, right? Honestly, there's a good chance that if the architect or contractor agreed to it, they probably still in their gut don't feel good about it. And what that means is, because I've been in meetings like this where I'm like, I think it can work. And then I end up saying, okay, let's try it. But I know in my gut, like, something doesn't feel right. And it doesn't feel right because I've had years and years and years of experience. And that experience is telling me in my gut, don't do this, right? Because it means that there is some reason, often more than one reason, that this is not a good idea. I just can't think of it at the moment because I have to recall how many projects of data, right? So when you are a professional who has enough experience, you get to that level where you have that kind of instinctive response to, this is not a good idea, or this is a good idea. We should go this route. And so I don't know what that's worth, but I can see very easily where if a client pitches something like this to an architect and they agree with it, maybe ask your architect, well, what's your gut telling you? Because if their gut's saying don't do it, then I would probably listen to that more so than anything else. And that's also just to say that's the reality of the complexity of these projects. It's almost not possible to remember the 1,000 different reasons why one decision is good or bad.
So really, I think to conclude this fourth point is that if you really want to manipulate or shortcut the process, at least do it at the very beginning. Have a plan, be honest with whoever you're hiring for your project, because I think that's kind of like one other thing that's not cool is when halfway through the process, people like want to rock the process. Don't do that in the middle of it.
Sure.
Not a good idea. For anything, not a good idea.
Sure.
Come up with a plan, have clear lines of communication, implement strategies from the very beginning, and establish a process that works for what you're trying to do.
Yeah, it's really to say that if you want to be efficient, you just need to be thorough and detailed. That's the best thing. It reminds me also, people always ask, like, how do I get a permit faster, right? And in small time building departments in like really small towns, maybe your cousin knows the planner and that's like one way of it. But in bigger cities where things are much more structured and you don't have that kind of back alley way of doing things, there is no shortcut to getting a permit, right? The best way to get a permit quickly is to be thorough and detailed in your research and apply and talk to the planners and use them as a resource.
And start talking to architects when you're starting thinking about your project.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, don't wait until you have to build it.
So efficiency is gained by operating a certain way, not by removing things. All of this is to really say that the entire architecture, design, and construction process from the very beginning to the very end, success is all about spending a little bit of time and money now to save time and money later. That's all it's about. So if you're ever at a moment where you think, well, I can spend less time and money right now, and I think it's going to be okay, don't do that. And it's even as simple as, I have this piece of information I want to convey to the contractor, but I think that they understand what they're supposed to do well enough, so I'm just going to assume that they know what to do. No. Pick up the phone, spend the 2 minutes, call them, and it will save you probably hours later on.
Yeah.
That's just how the game works. The fifth and final point is communicating with your partner if you have a partner and you're going to be co-living together in the house.
That could be a touchy feeling point, I feel, to tell people that, because I don't think anyone really says it. I think it's a conversation that architects have amongst architects, you know, like when sometimes you talk about your clients, and it's something that comes up really often, is that the dynamic between couples and partners, which, you know, whatever people's relationship are is whatever they're into. Like I'm not interested in knowing that. But how does that affect a design project?
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that, again, if you want to talk about efficiency, that's one thing that clients could work on eventually, is how they communicate with their significant others to be more efficient in those design meetings and also making decisions and therefore moving the project forward. It's silly, but you would be surprised how many people might not be on the same page. And, you know, and in a way that's understandable. Oftentimes, couples are in different professions. Therefore, their brain is wired differently than maybe on their downtime, you know, the things and the interests that they have in common. So the way they process information and receive it and make decision could be very different.
Absolutely. Most of the time it's different. Yeah.
Most of the time it's different. So, you know, I think when we talk about on point one, kind of thinking about the bigger picture, on point two, thinking about the bigger picture while you're doing the project, that is probably a conversation you should have with your partner.
Absolutely.
To make sure that you're on the same page, even before you reach out to anyone. Because if you're not, well, maybe there is a little bit of work that needs to happen within your relationship to get on the same page, or at least, you know, understand like what is more important for either of you, who maybe is the person that this project is more important to. You know, sometimes in a couple, there's always one that's kind of driving the project and the other one is just taking the passenger seat, and that's fine. But establishing that from the get-go, I think, is better than having two personalities trying to drive the ship when really that's a conversation that's not for the design meeting. You know?
Right. Well, so first and foremost, you have to be able to communicate with each other. If you can't do that, the project can still happen. It's just going to be painful for everybody, and it's going to take a lot longer. So some of the knowing what you want it to be or having a clear vision, I do think that it is very common for the architect or designer to be involved in that, to be the third person, to help guide the partners, or even if it's one client, to the right path. I mean, that's what we're here to do, really, first and foremost. But if these two people, they can't communicate with each other because they don't get along or whatever, then obviously nothing works. And we've seen some clients who think they can get by and throughout the process without communicating with their partner. And they say, well, they're not really going to be involved. 95% chance they are going to be involved because they live there too. So I think it's what like Oprah says, the communication's foundation of any good relationship. It's really that, right? And if you're the type of people to say, well, we're going to make decisions together on every single thing, great.
Yeah.
If you're the type of people that say, well, look, we can communicate with each other, but we also know we have completely different tastes. So guess what? You are going to be in charge of this part. You have full authorship over the kitchen. I just want to be able to say this is where my protein shakes are going to be stored,
right.
But just be very clear. Compromise, yeah. But compromise, but also just be very clear with each other about the delineations of the scope of responsibilities, the scope of final decisions, and all of those things. And this topic of communicating with your partner is another reason why we say to all of our clients at the beginning, and in fact, it's in our contract, that whoever is going to have the power of making design decisions, they have to be present at that meeting, at the design meeting. We don't just send work to clients, we always have a meeting with them. And if we're talking about, let's say, the great room space or the floor plan of the entire house, and there's two partners and they're both going to be involved in that, they both have to be at that meeting. They have to. We've seen in the past where sometimes clients and some architects think, well, we'll just have the husband at the meeting, and then later on they're going to fill in the husband or fill in the wife later on, and it'll be just as good. It's not. It doesn't work. And again, I know it's a pain in the butt for some people to have to make the time for an hour and a half or an hour to have both people present at a meeting because everyone's busy. But guess what? That 1 hour we figure out together as a 4 will save time later on.
Yeah, otherwise you just keep spinning your wheels and producing options to try to satisfy the person who's never part of the meeting. And at this point, you're just shooting in the dark, honestly. Mm-hmm. The other thing, too, in the communication between partners is the transparency about the financials. Yeah. The budgets, the spending,
Sounds obvious.
How much do you feel comfortable spending in a sofa? How much do you feel comfortable, spending in this whole new home project? Because the person who makes the decisions isn't necessarily the person who's in charge of the money and the financials. And
sometimes not.
And sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But it makes sense that everybody's on the same page because, again, there is a lot of things that are possible in the design world, like from really low end to extremely expensive stuff. And I think just setting a ground where everybody feels comfortable makes our life as designers easier. And again, make sure that we're not pitching stuff that we can do.
Yeah, and I do think you are kind of pointing to basically professionalism. There is a line, we become very close with our clients because it's the nature of the work, but it's still a professional transaction that's taking place, if we want to even describe it that way. And so, for clients who are listening, you should know, I guess, that there's this running joke that all designers and architects have, that in addition to being a designer and architect, we're therapists. I mean, if I had a penny for every time I've heard that, then I'd have $1. But that's often the feeling. And again, it is a part of the role of the architect and the designer to engage in very personal conversations, to extract that information, like I said earlier, to help people figure out the right path and sculpt the vision that makes sense for them. However, it is, again, a professional setting. And at some point, you need to get your house in order. Because if that,
and to be, again, completely transparent on this topic, you would be surprised or not surprised if you've gone through a project to know that some of those projects end up in divorces. Sure. That is why we're making this, point 5 of this conversation, is that people do not understand the toll that embarking on those home projects could take on a relationship. Mm-hmm. If you're not prepared, if you're not equipped for it. again, you can wing it and see if you get lucky or not. But if you're not get lucky, you might end up being divorced, and to me, that's not worth it. I mean, you're getting divorced over arguing. The project.
Okay. First of all, just to be clear, that's not happened with us, but we've heard of it really many times. It's not just as a myth. But also, I would argue, well, then maybe it wasn't meant to be. But no, here's the thing: is that.
But in that case, don't hire people to do that.
Here's the thing, is that if you are in a relationship and you're living with that person, you are going to have to collaborate, right? And there's different forms of collaboration, as I said earlier. Sometimes it's intense. Sometimes it's lopping off one chunk and it belongs to you and I'm not going to touch that. And it's very clean, but you're going to have to figure that out. So I would advise anyone listening that if you're embarking on a project, don't think that you can get by without having to speak with your significant other about a lot of these decisions, because it will come up. And of course, it again, use the architect and designer to help you make decisions, but perhaps just not to play therapist.
And also, don't make the design professional take one side or the other. That's just not cool. And also, I think at the end of the day, you're building a home, not just a house, right? It's also in the best case scenario where the two partners work really well hand in hand on a project. At the end, like you've built something together, right? Like you've managed to work together on a project, even if again your professions are completely different and you never do that in the work life. Like you did that together, and I think that's very important. When a project is completed, it's successful, everybody's happy, you feel like you've bonded even more with your partner because you managed to do that all together. I think it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I agree. And if we can be the guiding light through that, then all the better.
All right, so to wrap it up, we're just going to kind of resume these 5 points that we talked about to help clients in doing projects.
Yeah, the first one is, if you want to start, then you got to start.
You got to start.
You got to start. Doing research is great, but to really make progress, you have to start that process with an architect.
Yeah. The second one is, of course, figuring out why you're doing the project. It might sound silly, but a lot of people just go ahead with a project without asking the big question, why am I doing that?
The deeper, foundational, fundamental question of what you want this project to give you in the end. The third point is to not count on luck, to be relentlessly thorough and throughout the process. Trust your professionals. Don't think that you've got the golden ticket to go to the Wonka factory for the entire project for this one thing, and you're going to roll the dice and it'll probably be okay. Stay away from probably.
Yeah. Number 4 is, of course, don't try to manipulate or shortcut the process. You might think that you could make it more efficient and save money and time. Ultimately, it doesn't really happen that way. I think the best
By cutting out stuff,
the best way is really just to establish the plan, your process, before you start anything.
Yeah, and have the right professionals that fit it, Yeah. I do want to expand on that real quick, actually. So every project is different in terms of design, but also a little bit in terms of construction, especially when we talk about custom residential work. That doesn't mean that the professionals are reinventing the process completely every time. It means that we're tweaking stuff to make it fit what you're trying to do. An easy example is that if we're designing and building a house, a speculative house that is going to be built and then sold immediately for profit, that is a very different process in a way from designing a custom house where this family of 4 is going to live in there for the next 30 years and it's going to get passed down to their grandkids. Two completely different projects, completely different visions, goals, and therefore, to a degree, the processes. Now, that's why understanding the vision also feeds back into this one of there won't be a need to shortcut or remove stuff out of the process if we have an understanding of doing what's right for you from the outset.
Yeah. And last point 5, is the communication with your partner on the project. Something that maybe is not talked about enough in our industry, but as an insider, I would give you a tip is, make sure that you communicate well with your partner before you hire people and start working on the project, because it could could really help, and it could also really damage a project.
It is for sure. And I think with that last point and then the vision one, and again, more philosophically, it's really about knowing yourself and being really honest with yourself and therefore also your partner. If you can achieve that level of honesty, that again makes the base for the project and everything becomes just way easier after
It would
that.
be way smoother.
Yeah. If you like what we're doing, then you can support the show by leaving a review of the podcasts in the Apple Podcast app, also Spotify and on YouTube. You can find the show on Instagram, Second Studio Pod, and that's also the name of the website. You can find our office, which is Fame Architecture and Design, also on Instagram, Fame_Architects, and the website, and everywhere else, whatever, we're out there. For the show, if you have a question or suggestion, a topic suggestion, which we always welcome those, then you can text our hotline, which is 213-222-6950, or DM us or email us or whatever. We try to be on top of those for topic suggestions in particular. If you're a client, you're like, this is a great thing. I have a really good question that no one gives me the answer to. Can you please answer it? Let us know.
Don't be shy. We won't judge.
Okay. Yeah. No, of course not. Good?
Yep.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.